Another method to build wooden strong structures in balloon framing. This is a process in which heavy timbers are replaced with studs, and those studs are held together only with nails. In the 19th century, the availability of cheap wood from the logging industry led to the balloon frame innovation in construction for houses and other small structures. Originally named balloon framing due to the preconceptions of old-timers who thought this construction method was as fragile as a balloon. This method, used since 1833, made possible the rapid settlement of the American western frontier. Here we see the John Ward House in Salem, Massachusetts. It is a first period house in medieval styling. It represents an example of one of the oldest wooden constructed houses in America. A note, the wooden roof shingles without flashing or underlayment, and the wooden clapboard siding. And then in the picture over on the right, you'll see tons of balloon frame houses constructed. Over 5,000 of these relief cottages were created after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. They were built using single wall construction. Balloon framing, in this case, provided cheap and very fastly created shelter. It helped a lot of people to survive a very rough time. Now, newer developments of quick architectural methods in the vein of balloon framing are continuing to evolve to this day. A home like this one can be built in less than 24 hours at a cost of only $4,000. The secret, 3D printing. And the goal of this was to help families living in poverty or unsafe conditions. This is an architectural firm that's called New Story, which is a housing charity organization. They collaborated with Icon, a construction tech company, partnering to create housing relief for those that were devastated during the Haiti tsunami that took place a few years ago. Very innovative approach. Now, cast iron became technically useful during the Industrial Revolution, and it led to new types of structures in which heavy load-bearing walls were no longer needed. Iron has much greater strength than most stone and can span much longer distances. The engineering of structures with iron was a prelude to the development of steel towards the end of the 19th century and steel reinforced concrete in the 20th century. And here we can see just a little bit of where cast iron is especially used. In the two images on the right, we see bridge construction. And then the image over on the left is an example of what reinforced concrete looks like. After the iron industry was established, cast and wrought iron became important building materials. Stronger and more fire-resistant than wood, iron led to lighter exterior walls and more flexible use of interior space. Factories, bridges, and railroad stations were among the new types of buildings from which cast iron was used. In Paris, the 980-foot Eiffel Tower, designed and built by civil engineer Gustave Eiffel, spirit of which new cast iron structures could be created. At the time of its design and construction, the tower was highly controversial because of its disruption of the low skyline of Paris. People thought it was a real thorn in their side of sky. When it was built, it was the world's tallest freestanding structure. Even now, it is the city's most visible symbol that dominates the Paris skyline. The Statue of Liberty is 151 feet. It's a copper statue, a gift from France to the people of the United States. And it was designed by French sculptor Bartholdi. It was built by Gustave Eiffel, and the statue was dedicated on October 28, 1886. Bartholdi, the sculptor, gathered interested parties in the project. An architect, a builder, Gustave Eiffel, and a chief engineer, who designed a brick pier within the statue to which the skin would be anchored, and who also chose the metal which would be used for the skin, the copper sheets. The shaping of the copper was a technique called repoussé, in which the sheets were heated and then struck with wooden hammers. And this was an advantage choice for the entire statue, as it would be light for its volume. And the copper itself only needed to be 2¼ millimeters thick. Now keep this in mind as we move forward, because you'll see future contemporary architects employ techniques that feed off of the choices that the engineer designed in this first project. Well, this is the Crystal Palace. It was designed by Joseph Paxton, and it was a spectacular demonstration of what cast iron can do in architecture. It was built for an exhibition of the works of Industry of All Nations, the first international exposition held in 1851. The building was designed to show off the latest mechanical inventions. It was built from prepared materials in 6 months and enclosed 21 acres of park. And this was the first time that new industrial methods and materials were eloquently presented as architecture. In its day, the Crystal Palace was recognized as a highly original expression of the spirit of the New Age. There was no borrowing from earlier styles. Paxton used lightweight, factory-made modules of cast iron and glass. And this really freed him from past styles and any kind of academic constitutions of masonry construction. Paxton created a whole new architectural vocabulary in this work. The light, decorative quality of the glass and cast iron units were created not by applied ornamentation, but by the structure itself. The modular unit was inspired by new structures Paxton said of that nature gave him the idea. The modular units provided enough flexibility for the entire structure to be assembled on site, right over existing trees, and then later disassembled and moved across town. Imagine the light as being viewer of the space. This building and all that it displayed was highly celebrated. People traveled from far to see the exposition. And unfortunately, the Crystal Palace burned following its move to its second location. Paxton's successful innovation was a new application of the concept of form follows function. Now, this concept that I'd like you to make sure that you know for test-taking purposes. Form follows function is a principle associated with late 19th and early 20th century architecture and industrial design in general. It means the shape of a building or object should primarily relate to its intended function or purpose. The next breakthrough in construction methods for large structures came between 1890 and 1910 with the development of high-strength structural steel used as the reinforcing material of concrete. The extensive use of cast iron skeletons in the mid-19th century prepared the way for multi-story steel frame construction in the late 1890s. New building techniques and materials, as well as new functional needs, demanded a fresh approach to structure and form. The movement began to take shape in commercial architecture and was symbolized by early skyscrapers. You've heard the story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over the lantern and burning down the city of Chicago. And you've also probably been to Chicago and seen the citywide street art project of sculptural cows painted in varied styles to decorate the city for tourists as an emblem to its history. Now keep this in mind as we move forward, because this is a really important moment in the rebuilding of Chicago and what starts to happen with architecture in America. One of the first major opportunities for this new style of architecture to take off was in Chicago, where this great Chicago fire of 1871 cleared the way for building. As I'm sure you're aware, Chicago is an important industrial port city that's located in the center of the United States. It's a hub for importing and exporting material goods, whether it be from rivers or by railroads. But when the great city of Chicago burned, it was important that the city be rebuilt, and it be rebuilt quickly. Now, timing was perfect for European creatives, architects, artists, graphic designers, and they needed to escape Europe due to the world wars, where they were being persecuted and needed jobs. And so many of them immigrated to New York City and Chicago. Louis Sullivan was regarded as the first great modern architect. Sullivan had a major influence on the early development of what became America's most original contribution to architecture in the 20th century, the skyscraper. Let's take a moment to consider why buildings were limited in constructed height prior to these inventions. Basically, stonework supporting load-bearing walls needed to be thicker, sometimes as thick as 15 feet, and thinner at the top, maybe as thin as 3 to 2 feet, depending on the height of the wall. And if the architect couldn't do this, the wall would literally cave in. So steel reinforced concrete changes this architectural concern radically. The other thing that we must consider prior to skyscrapers is that there was no electricity. So here's a little food for thought. Even if we had the ability to build 15 to 50-story skyscrapers, would you want to be a worker that started off your day by a 50-story stair climb? So the first skyscraper is Sullivan's Wainwright Building in St. Louis, Missouri. It was made possible by the invention of the elevator. don't forget that, for test-taking purposes, and by the development of the use of steel for a structural skeleton. Also very important. The building breaks with tradition in a bold way. Its exterior design reflects the internal steel frame and emphasizes the height of the structure, its horizontal element. And also emphasized are its window areas. Sullivan divided the building's facade into three distinct zones: the base, the shaft, and the capital. These areas also revealed various functions of the building. Shops were located at the base, offices in the central section or shaft, and there was a heavily ornamented band at the top, the cornice or the capital. And this band, it's basically put there to stop the vertical thrust. This design of the building in the piers that are located, and then you also note that there's a decorative work between the windows, which also slow down that vertical thrust. Sullivan rethought architecture from the inside out in this work. Very important. Louis Sullivan, he comes to Chicago. He partners with another architect whose name is Adler, and they build a very historical and reputable firm called the Sullivan Adler. Sullivan importantly develops several buildings that are still standing in Chicago: the Carson Pier Scott Building, the Chicago Stock Exchange, and these are also skyscrapers with steel reinforced concrete. And then just a couple of things to show you that he does some really innovative things in terms of embellishment. You'll notice the facade on this corner entrance of the department store building, and it's clad in this very decorative metal scroll, very art nouveau-ish, if you will. And then the other thing that he comes up with is, if you look upward at the actual windows, you'll notice that there are what is called the Chicago style window. So looking out of a window, your view is not broken by panes of glass. You'll notice that there's one large central section of the window that marked it as being entirely designed different than any other type of window. It's a big picture window, and notice that there's two smaller windows on the side. So if this is pre air conditioning era, and those windows could open up and allow the breeze to come in from outside. So both very important innovative elements that add to the vocabulary of Sullivan's work. Between 1910 and 1913, a new spirit of architecture injects decorative ornamentation and eclecticism, as well as traditional stone and wood construction, and it breaks from any kind of earlier ideas of building as mass. The resulting international style, also called International Modernism, expresses the function of each building as its underlying structure and a logical, austere, asymmetrical plan. Now, this is important because many of the architects, European architects, especially the ones located in Germany, they were creating a school of design located in Berlin that was called the Bauhaus. And there they trained architects, they trained graphic designers, they trained industrial designers, they trained painters and photographers and artists of all sorts. Hitler hated any kind of innovation that these artists were coming up with and inventing, and really kind of chased these artists out of Europe. Is these artists that to the United States and were looking for jobs, and they became situated not only in Chicago but other cities throughout the U.S., such as New York City, and some very famous schools of art. The two big names that especially famous are Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. They both were directors of the Bauhaus. And Mies van der Rohe, he comes directly to Chicago, and he starts the Illinois Institute of Technology. And then we're going to spend just a little time looking at the Distill Bauhaus international style, early to mid 1900s. And this style is noted for being the Distill for being about creating spaces that are a utopian environment. Usually these architectural features are clean, they're undecorated, they are built for having function. The thought is for the people that live in those spaces. And usually there's one other thing is that the architects would typically contrast between natural and manufactured forms. Now, Walter Gropius, he carried out the principles of international style in his new building for the Bauhaus when the school moved to Dessau, Germany, and it moved from Berlin. The building demonstrates basic components of steel, column, and reinforced concrete slab construction. It had reinforced concrete floors and roof interior supported by load-bearing steel columns, which made it possible to vary placement of interior walls, as well as exterior coverings. Exterior walls didn't need to carry any weight, and so they could be made of glass, which would, of course, light the spaces. And I don't know if you've ever worked in a space that has no windows, but it's absolutely horrible. So they were really thinking about bringing outside light to the inside. Therefore, there was this kind of acute awareness of the importance of natural light. And in this slide, we can see not only exteriors of the Bauhaus space, but also interiors. And notice that they're using primary colors. There's a lot of white wall spaces. And this idea is that, the people would, enhance the space. Their artwork and the things that they would make would enhance the space. So this is the first that we really start to see these spaces as living spaces as, gallery walls. In the United States, the development of the high-rise building reached its climax in New York. In heavily populated Manhattan, tall buildings provided a way to supply even more residential and commercial space. And by 1950, New York was suffering from poor air circulation and reduction of sunlight because so many skyscrapers were built straight up from the sidewalk, meaning that there was no air coming in, there was no light coming in. So by the 1920s, a new law required architects to tear their structures back from the street to allow sunlight to enter what were quickly becoming these incredible dark canyons. We see this in the architecture of Mies van der Rohe in his Philip Johnson Sequin building in New York. This building was created between 1956 and 1958. You'll notice that the building has no load-bearing exterior walls, that the walls are glass, and this is a major feature of Mies van der Rohe's skyscrapers. In the Seagram building, the interior floor space is gained by the height of the building, which allows the architect to leave large open public areas at the base. And you'll also notice that there are vertical lines that emphasize the height of the exterior of the building and provide a strong pattern that is capped by a top section that's designed to give a sense of completion. This is a very austere design, and it embodies Mies van der Rohe's incredibly famous statement, "Less is more." Make sure that you know that for the test. Less is more. Also, I might mention very quickly here, you'll see an image of Mies van der Rohe in the center at the top. And most architects that came out of the Bauhaus era and those following not only will create building in design, but they'll also create furniture, and usually there's always a characteristic chair that the architect has invented, and maybe the most famous of Mies's chair would be the lower one that's called the Barcelona chair. Mies van der Rohe was a leading proponent of the international style, which had an enormous and sometimes negative influence on the world of architecture mid-century. The uniformity of glass covering geometric grid structure is what's considered the appropriate formal dressing for the bland modernity of corporation. And I believe that we're getting into the era where we see more and more misuse of this kind of idea. Mies coined the term skin and bone style architecture that very much dealt with the principle of less is more. And so this idea of less is more is that you only employ minimal elements to achieve optimum design. In the case of Mies's work, if we look at the work over on the right, the Picasso sculptures in front of it, and this building is located in Chicago, you'll note that the pavilion in front of the building is made with a granite, and then that granite follows all the way indoors and up through the shaft of the elevators. So there's this seamless use of very minimal granite. The other thing is that the steel on the exterior of the building mimics some of the fine, even though it's steel, it mimics bronze, which is some of the finest sculpture material available. So that dark, velvety feeling of the piece is very rich in its endeavor. And then notice that he's taking simple shape and line and using those in very minimal patterns throughout the building. And so you also see that their collection of all these buildings that are all located in Chicago. The Daley Plaza building with the Picasso. The middle work is the Lakeshore Apartments, which are twin buildings. And then you'll notice the two images on the far left. One of them has a Alexander Calder piece in red in front of it. And then you'll notice that there's a kind of a larger, more minimal glass building down on the bottom. This is the post office located in downtown. Mies also was commissioned to do homes for residential purpose, and this is the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. It's still kept as an architectural heritage site, and you can go and tour this if you're interested. I've been, and I've really enjoyed it, but you'll notice that Mies employs all these ideas of less is more. We see a little bit more materials in this, in that he designed all the furniture. He's also used wood for the interior walls. But you can imagine this was meant to be a riverside cottage. So the Farnsworth family would come outside of, leave Chicago for the weekend and come and relax in this space, and they would have beautiful views of the landscape around them. So they would actually have the exterior come inside. They could feel at one with nature. And that's the beauty of this place. Distill is translated as the style. It's also known as neoplasticism, and it was an artistic movement founded from 1917 to 1931 in the Netherlands by Theo van Doesburg, Piet Mondrian, and Gerhard Rietveld. These proponents of the Distill advocated pure abstraction and universality by reduction to the essentials of the geometry of straight line, the square, and the rectangle, and then combining those elements into strong asymmetrical designs. The Distill also employed pure primary colors with black and white. Works exploited a relationship between positive and negative elements, an arrangement of non-objective forms and lines. And really the goal of these artists were to create environments that were about, or were trying to get to being a utopian environment. These environments, they were about creating unity, and the goal was that ultimately we would live in an environment of harmony and no longer have need for or feel empty, feel entirely fulfilled. Now let's look at the next little section dealing with reinforced concrete architecture. And that includes steel rods and mesh reinforcements. And you'll notice that this architectural style will become much more sculptural.